All right, hi everybody. Welcome to this week's forecast discussion. Changing up the schedule a little bit. We're now on Fridays, but we're going to be talking about our recent verification from February 19th to February 23rd. And then we can talk about this week's forecast and any other things that people want to discuss. I think we'll just stick to our normal schedule today where we do forecast attribution, and then we can talk about this week's forecast, and maybe we can have Paul give a more in-depth summary of his forecast. This is the first time we've had him on a call in a while, so and then we can see where the discussion leads us after that. So I will bring up the latest verification from this week. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So I already have this sorted by the our skill metric. And as we can see, it was a very, very tough week for everybody. Actually, it was tough for everybody except for the CFS, just barely. I think I said that in my tweet and this week. I know last week I wasn't at the discussion, but it seemed that it was a cold verification. A lot of people struggled as well. So this is 2 weeks in a row. Maybe we're starting a little bit of that pattern shift that we were worried about, seeing how warm it was. But yeah, if we can look at these standings here, the verification came in at 135, and most people were below that. The 30-year normal was 133, so verification just came up just above it. But like I said, looks like for the most part, I think only Aaron from Albany was the only one who was directionally correct for the human forecasters, but I think because her spread was so large, she still got that negative score. But
Tell her congratulations in class on Tuesday.
Yeah. She was
in the 440 class.
Looks like she was the only, like I said, she was the only one who was on the right side of the 30-year normal. But like I said, it was a pretty tough week for all of us. So I can come over here and we can look at the what the actual temperature pattern was. I don't know if anybody has actually looked at this yet. I have not.
Are you 55?
Yeah, so this is again, like I said, this is the first time I've looked at this, but yeah, looks like we kind of a different pattern than what we've been seeing recently. A lot of cold in the south, and I don't know. I guess this is a question for everybody. Is the south still in that HDD range right now? Like, are they still actually even accumulating HDDs at this point?
Yeah, I can answer that in sort of in an unrelated way. I was just talking to a guy who's down in Houston right now, and they got down to, I guess, freezing last night or a day ago or the last couple days. And apparently it created a water main break, and a lot of, I guess maybe millions, but a lot of people in Houston don't have running water, or it's not safe right now because temperatures just got a little bit below freezing there and caused some big problems.
Well, yeah, I guess that answers the question. If they are, that kind of sucks.
How do you freeze a water main just being a little below freezing?
I have no idea.
I think there must have been something else going on.
Oh, yeah, I don't know.
Extraordinary coincidence.
So yeah, I can't really, I don't know what the pattern looked like the week before. Does anyone remember if this was something similar to what we saw from last week?
You could also pull that up if you. It's really easy on this to go like 5 days. Yeah, you could do it that way, or where it says shift years, months. They have something where you can like shift back like 5 years. So if you just want to do that real quick, shift period. That's it. If you do the minus side, yeah, it'll go back a few days. You can do it real quick. There you go. Yeah, it's a pretty topsy-turvy.
Yeah. Oh, I know for the Northeast last weekend, it was really, really quite warm. So must have been accumulating somewhere else. But we can come back and we can look at Dynacast's report from that day. Let's see what the models were showing. So that was the 4th query.
Your prices are really moving around a lot.
Yeah, it again looks like based on this Maxar's pattern, looks like they had something that wasn't even close. The EC and the CFS weren't really, especially the southeast pattern. And the EC has warmth, CFS has warmth, Maxar went with warmth. So I don't know if this was a matter of still not shifting gears from the extreme warmth we had been seeing, but yeah, this was a tough week for everybody. So I don't know. Does anybody have any thoughts? Don't necessarily like calling people out, but I know someone like, Dr. Decker and Dr. Roundy seem to have pretty tough forecasts, but they've been doing well for a while.
Hey, and Zach, real quick, this was a forecast made on February 4th, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so just for folks who are jumping on for the first time or whatnot, these are all 16 to 20-day forecasts. So this was forecast, made on the 4th, verifying for Feb 19th to the 23rd, our most recent weekly verification.
I've been making mine on Fridays.
That's right, Paul. In fairness, Paul. And actually, that's a great point, too. It'll be interesting once we switch gears and talk about the most recent forecast, because, it's even a couple days can make a big difference in terms of what the model guidance is showing.
Yeah, Dr. Roundy, I was curious, have you found that it's more difficult to make your forecast? Because pretty much everyone else makes theirs on Tuesdays and you make yours on Fridays. So yours is technically like a 20 to 24 day forecast. Have you found that that's more difficult?
Well, it should be. I think it is. I don't know, because my techniques are similar either way. The difficulty is that it's harder to take advantage of what's going on at the end of the European Center and GFS model cycles. So because if you're looking out to day 15 and then trying to check the climate model comparisons between you want to check the comparison of the climate model signal at the beginning of the 16 to 20 day period, compare its similarity to the more skillful ECMWF ensembles, and you're just another 5 days out of range, so you can't really do that as easily.
Yeah, I think either way, like, look at the heating season overall. I still think, Dr. Roundy, you've been doing quite well. Yeah, I mean, actually, I should take that back. I don't think any of the consistent forecasters are doing better than the 30-year, but still, it's been a really difficult winter. But either way, you have had some good forecasts along the way. I should say that. I know the standings aren't necessarily showing that, but
it might be worth, Zach, if you want to pull up the summary all, we can look at directional. I like looking at the directional correctness.
Yeah.
That's a good one too. I know Professor Decker's always done well with the directional correctness. I think he's historically been number one as far as human forecasts. Yeah.
A lot of people I see on this list who aren't really doing it very much.
No, there's a couple of the folks at the top there, the hundreds, you have to look over at the right side at the counts. There's a few ones and twos there. Carl Schreck, he's 100%, but he's 1 for 1.
Well, I guess, does anybody have any last thoughts about this past week?
Hey, this is Nat.
Hey, Nat.
Hey, it's not so much about this week in general, but maybe more of the winter. Just thought I'd share. I saw a seminar here yesterday by Amy Butler, and she's a expert on stratosphere troposphere interactions. But one thing that one thing I saw in one of her slides that kind of struck me is that so she had looked at whether how well do forecasts perform. You have a very weak stratospheric polar vortex or a very strong stratospheric polar vortex in weeks 3 and 4. I guess the initial hypothesis might be if you have a strong signal in the stratosphere, that your skill may be better in the longer range, weeks 3 and 4, because you have, this signal that should be a source of skill. But what she showed it, in general, I mean, there are some regions where that is true, but a number of regions where it's not. And one thing that struck me is that in the figure she showed, when the model is initialized with a strong stratospheric vortex, skill over the eastern US looked much worse in weeks 3 and 4 than normal. And I think that's based on models in the S2S database. So I think that includes ECMWF, CFS, and others. But anyway, it just seemed to seem consistent with what we've seen this year. We've had that very strong polar vortex, and forecasts over the eastern US just have not been very good in that longer range.
I think that's a really interesting point because, and Dave D'Arcangelo could probably speak to this a little bit on either side, but my thought is, there's a rule of thumb I think in the market that says when you have certain weather, teleconnections or features that are in a strong phase, that you have better forecast skill. Like for example, that hey, if you get if the NAO is really strong, or I guess forecast to be strong, then you have higher confidence in a certain outcome. If the El Nino is a certain intensity or level, you have higher confidence in a certain outcome. And, it's always been sort of a rule of thumb, I think, but I'm not sure it's, at least to my knowledge, it's been well tested, at least a lot of the different, phenomena, NAO, PNA, and stuff like that. And I'm not sure what the case is, right? If it really would hold up under a lot more scrutiny.
With the stratosphere polar vortex, when it's strong, at any point going forward, there can be a breakdown in the signal. But when it's broken down, it takes quite a time to spin up. And so when you're in a broken down state, there may be a little bit more certainty because you can't break it down when it's broken down, and it doesn't just immediately spin back up. I mean, a vortex can wobble off the pole and wobble back on, but if there's a full displacement or breakdown, it has to develop again in situ, and that's a process that is more driven by long-term radiation dynamics rather than so when you're in a state where the polar vortex is disrupted, then you have more certainty because you can't disrupt something that's already, and it's the synoptic variability that does the disruption, the synoptic and subseasonal variability.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, Paul, I was just going to say, like, intuitively, I hear what you're saying, but from a forecast standpoint, I almost think like it leads to the opposite forecast outcome. In other words, again, this is experientially, it's subjectively, but when the vortex is broken down, agree everything with what you said, but then experientially, it feels to me like there's less forecast confidence for the areas that historically I've forecasted for the United States, Eastern United States. In other words, example is sometimes that the models don't resolve it well. Like the models will say, hey, the NAO is going back positive again on day 15, but no, it's not. It doesn't verify that way. Maybe because the broken down vortex has a longer impact. Again, I've never tested this. This is just a feel thing, but it feels that way to me that when the vortex is broken down, that US HDD forecasts are sometimes more difficult.
So the skill difference isn't very large, and so you think of the difference in uncertainty between starting with an existent strong vortex and a broken down vortex is still pretty poor at weeks 3 and 4 in any model, and so you might find patterns in there that may not really stand out in bulk analysis. In any case, the skill in either case is low. But when you just like if you start your model in a strong MJO signal, you end up with higher skill than if you didn't have it. But the difference in skill is only 6 to 10% or something.
Right. Fair enough.
You still have a high failure rate.
By the way, just one other thing that related to what Paul's bringing up, and for other folks, feel free to jump in on this. One of the other, when you say something like that, Paul, the other thing that just jumps to mind as related to medium range forecasting in general, is that sometimes it's really hard for us forecasters to figure out the attribution, figure out the weighting to put to each of these things. Snow cover, MJO, sunspot cycle, whatever. And I think that's always been one of the challenges. And I think sometimes where bias creeps in, where, you're making, in particular, maybe like a seasonal forecast, and hey, you've got an EDSO or you've got something else. And it's like, well, it probably has some relationship, but if it only explains, if whether it's positive or negative, ultimately it's only explaining, a relatively small percentage of that forecast, then it's very easy to overweight it, and bias yourself based on one or two data points in your toolbox, so to speak.
The variance you don't explain will always be larger at week 3 and beyond.
Yeah.
But when you make many forecasts, if you have some basis of skill that accounts for a few percent improvement, then you'll find that over many forecasts, you'll have a few percent improvement.
Right.
All right. Well, if anyone else has any last thoughts about anything from the past, we can certainly talk about that. But if not, I will move on to.
Hey, Zach, could you hold on one second? Is it Zach, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And Dave, do you mind if I put in my 2 cents for a minute or two?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So anyway, thanks for having me join this morning, Dave. I appreciate it, and glad to participate. I'm a private sector meteorologist with Susquehanna International Group in outside of Philadelphia, and I've been in operational forecasting in the commodity space for almost 20 years now. So not as old as Dave, but I'm pretty old. One peculiar thing, I'm very curious about this time period that you guys just verified, and with all due respect, it was a very challenging window, one of the probably more challenging ones of the winter, because it was a real breakdown and deviation from the predominant winter pattern of kind of a predominant eastern ridge, and the notable cold across the south. It was actually also a very wet week, and in a sense, the deviation map looks classically weak El Nino with kind of an active southern branch. And I think one fascinating thing about that time window was it was a time when about the week preceding that was a very pronounced negative move in the SOI, which really kind of kicked off a really active southern branch for a week to 10 days, which kind of ran smack into the middle of that verification period. So it was typically cold south. Februarys are very wet. This was no exception. It's been a really wet month down there. And so that was a very interesting part of this winter, which is that we came out of this prolonged period. And one notable thing about when you made that forecast on the 4th, I actually was going over some of my forecast notes. I keep like a bit of a daily diary with regards to thought processes and what I'm kind of observing in the real-time space of both models and indices. And one of the interesting things about that, when you made those forecasts on the 4th, both the 3rd and the 4th of February were peculiar because at the end of the week 2 space, which is kind of right before your verification window started, it was a notably cold move by the European ensemble, which typically has not been the case this winter. This winter's been marked by a pronounced cold move and overly cold bias by the GFS, both operational and ensemble. But it was interesting that those 2 days we saw a bit of a flip in the signals, 13, 14, 15 days out in the future with regards to the European taking the lead. And I made a remark in my notes, of course. My view on it was that the winter, the period would stay predominantly warm, but it was interesting to me that the European was actually the one that actually flipped, for 3 or 4 cycles, and took a bit of a cold stance, in a sense, kind of signaling that. And I find it interesting that Dr. Roundy mentioned, with regards to some attribution to an MJO. We had wildly divergent MJO forecasts around that window as well. The MJO ended up resolving in a bit of a aggressive move out into the eastern, central Pacific, really. What is this, traditionally known as like phases 6 and 7, in which that was a real marker of that negative SOI that I mentioned earlier. But the MJO forecasts have been almost entirely unhelpful in that regard this winter. But it was the SOI that was maybe the bigger marker of really enhanced subtropical jet kicked off that rain in the southeast.
We have this pattern with a low frequency kind of central Pacific activity, and the MJO has had a shorter time scale this year than it normally has. Plus, when we have kind of a central Pacific or El Nino configuration, the MJO often has 2 centers of action set up at the same time. And the RMM index is really poor at handling this signal.
That's true, right?
EOFs 3 and 4 in order to see the depth of the structure. But there was definitely, you look in late January, there was an active period Western Indian Ocean, and then you can see Kelvin wave activity crossing the maritime continent, and arrival around the 12th of February in the Dateline region.
That's right.
And so this is the kind of explosion of convection and a major westerly wind event over the Western Pacific, but the RMM index really didn't capture it as well.
Right. That's a good point. No, thanks for adding that. And that was a very pronounced event then around the Dateline that persisted for 5 or 6 days. Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Well, I think I can shift to our new forecast. So yes, on Tuesday, we made forecasts for the period of March 11th to March 15th. I can just pull up some of the initial numbers here. The 30-year normal sitting at a value of 106, 10 years at 102. 5 year, all of our moving averages are below 100. Our NJO analog is at 107, trends at 93.2. And then we have all of our other human forecasters. Actually, both the EC and the CFS are both lower than the 30 years, so that's always an interesting occurrence. Dave Margolin, are you still there?
I am.
Yeah, I know you're getting ready to leave soon. Do you want to quickly go over your forecast before we let everybody else go?
Yeah, well, yeah, but it's going to be super quick. I was actually, unfortunately, I was actually traveling during this one, so I didn't have a chance to do too much. And so at the end of and it was, now I really can empathize for Paul, because I didn't have the EC weeklies or the updated EC weeklies. I don't know how he does it, but so at the end of the day, I decided to default to the 10-year normal, and there wasn't a lot of deep, obviously, thought process into that, other than I just felt like, taking a quick scan of the 30, 90-day longer term performance, that this winter, as Dave Darkangelis kind of alluded to, it's been on the warmer side of normal, right? I think we're targeted for the 4th or 5th, warmest Jan Feb period, December Jan Feb period since 1950. And so I just felt like, and of course, I also knew that the numerical model guidance in general hasn't performed that well, or I think below 30-year. So I felt like the best thing to do with not a lot of information and a lot of time was probably to go something close to the 10-year, and that's how I came up with my number. That's all I got.
All right. Well, I guess I'll start off the sharing the forecasts. I'll go with mine. So I forecasted a value of 98 HDDs with a normal spread of 22.8. My forecast formula, I kind of went back to one of my more comfortable formulas that I had come up with early on in the winter. Part of the reason I did this was because it seemed like we were in that incredibly warm period for a while, and then the last 2 weeks have been actually cold verification. So with this, what seems to be transition or back and forth type events, I went back to the formula that I started with. So it's a weighting scheme from this weighting scheme of the metrics on this page of 40% of the 30-year moving average, 30% of the 10-year normal, and 30% of the trend. Like I said, I usually pick some of the values from our summary tables that seem to be do consistently well, and just try and find a weighting scheme that balances those. I don't have the model pages from that day specifically, but I remember that I think it was the EC was showing considerable warmth across the country. The CFS was also showing some warmth across the country. And I think the only time I ever saw any sign of cold was actually in the CPC forecast. So based on a lot of these inputs on our page, I saw that seemed to be a lot of warmth. Again, I'm not always necessarily trusting of that, so I kept my spread at normal and just roll with my regular forecast of 40, 30, 30. Anybody have any questions about that? All right. Would like to go next?
I can go next.
Do you want to share your screen or anything, Mike?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
So my forecast was for 108.2 HDDs with average spread of 22.8. My formula is to look 60% at various teleconnections, mainly the AO, NAO, PNA, and EPO. Combine that 30% with the CPC and use the 30 years as a starting point. So for this period, the CPC was very cold, and I kind of agreed with that a little bit. The AO looked like it was weakening at the time. It's kind of a little bit more spaghetti-ish in its forecast now, so I'm a little worried about that. But I thought to be a colder West Coast due to the negative PNA. Usually means the West Coast is colder, and we get nice mild conditions on the East Coast. So that was the only thing I disagreed with the CPC about, is they had some colder temps on the eastern half of the country, which to me didn't make too much sense. But looking at so strong negative PNA with a weakening AO to me was a good colder west signal, or at least chilly, since it's kind of hard to get any kind of cold this year. But yeah, that's my forecast. Does anybody have any questions for it?
All right. Who would like to go next?
So since CPC was mentioned, I guess I can jump in. with my forecast, which, as always, just is the CPC forecast turned into my attempt to make it a number. So with that cold in the east, and especially the central plains, I did go with above normal heating degree days. With, I believe, an increased sigma to account for, the cold air if it's a little further south into the mid-Atlantic or the lower lakes. It could have a big increase in the HCDs, or it could move a little further north and not be a big deal. So that's where my number comes from. I guess I'm one of the colder forecasts based on this, just that CPC map.
I'm trying to see who's on the call here.
I haven't gone yet.
Okay.
I was actually a little bit confused about what I was going to be doing today in terms of discussion of a forecast, because in about 30 minutes or something, I'll be writing my forecast for today for the next cycle. But for the previous time, I was looking at a series of subseasonal tropical forcing signals that were suggesting a substantial cold signal during the period. Now, my heating degree day forecast is actually pretty close to normal, and my reasoning has been that in order to get that kind of subseasonal outcome, the waves have to be able to break and produce blocks in the right places. But if the polar vortex is that strong, the PP gradients are too strong along that northern periphery from Alaska to Greenland to maintain a block like that in place, to create a block of the magnitude necessary to produce that kind of transition. So if I would have been going just on my own statistical tools, I would have suggested a much higher heating degree day level. But it has to do with connecting those things to something that they're not statistically including. So the tropics modulates the polar vortex as well as the blocking patterns, but you have to consider the initial state of the atmosphere on which the tropical forcing signal is superimposed. And so unless those stratospheric signals or Arctic signals are included, the statistics are going to be off. Now, they've been pretty reliable for a lot of the winter, but it just in recent years didn't seem like it was a good, it was well connected. And looking at the models, I was comparing the tropical rainfall signals going forward, and basically the signal washes out, which means that in the ensemble going out far enough to get to the forecast period, the actual subseasonal component is mostly gone in the ensemble mean, and so there's some risk that a turnaround does occur, but I still think physically it takes a little bit more than the energy of the forcing modes that we've got coming in now to produce that kind of a transition. So it looks like more West Pacific is a source, wave breaking over the East Pacific, ultimately for the next forecast period puts a trough in the West, and we end up with a warmer outcome. So for the recent forecast period, I just went right close to the seasonal normals, with just a slight tweak toward my statistical signals.
Dr. Roundy, I noticed pretty much on a week-to-week basis, it seems that you use part of your strategy statement is to use the MGO guidance or something along those lines. What type of tools do you use? Is it something that you have on your own, or do you use something else? Like, when you talk about the MGO, what are you using?
I write my own statistical tools because I don't think that the indexes that are popularly used are always sufficiently inclusive of the actual variance in the tropics. So I like to look at tools that include the present state and structure of the MJO instead of just relying on its leading EOFs. So those tools use some OLR diagnostics that I developed back in 2012 and published in the Quarterly Journal. And they also use some new linear regression techniques that I've created that allow the regression slope coefficients to vary continuously about the seasonal cycle. And some of the tools also allow me to look at the base state of the upper tropospheric winds and use that to modulate the regression relationship between the tropical predictors and the other outcomes. And so I can see not only how the modes themselves, how the MJO is presently conditioned based on more than just a single index, but on a set of indexes that allow me to diagnose its full structure, but then also diagnose the how the background state is changing the outcome from the forcing. What I haven't included yet and will want to include after this year is a polar or Arctic predictor as a modulator in the system. I think that the normal RMM index signals are useful in a long-term sense. In individual events, they can do really well to the extent that they explain the signal that's actually present. But they don't really explain enough of the signal in every event, so that if you can be aware of the other aspects of the signal, you can put that back in and get a little more insight. That's all.
Cool, thank you.
I have Super Tuesday down to like very.
Let's see here. David Darkangelo, I don't know if you have any, if you're talking about your daily forecast notes, do you have any thoughts about this period? I know you didn't make a forecast on this page, but you know.
Sure. Yeah. No. Thanks for asking. No, obviously I'm fairly new to getting involved in the group, and so maybe hopefully make some forecasts going forward, and be a more active participant, and we can kind of size up how I've done, and be able to justify that. But looking at, I was doing that. I was glancing at some of the thoughts from earlier this week, and I think to reflect some of what Dr. Roundy had already mentioned, which is this really intense polar vortex, which is not, we're showing any signs of breaking down. We're seeing it wobble a bit, north of Alaska, and tending to shift somewhat more towards the Asia side. But regardless of that, it's the maintenance of that is really precluded of an actual shift. It was actually a surprising CPC outlook from earlier this week. I should note that was perhaps a bit of an outlier compared to where a lot of the vendor space was in what I see on the commodity side. That the fact that they went basically normal in the east and the south, was kind of a faint reflection of a Florida ridge, and then this cold intrusion in the north central states, which kind of belied against guidance. Yeah, you put that up now. That area below normal over New England, there's maybe some small justification for some backdoor fronts there. And there's also a worry that with how much snow we've potentially putting in across the northern part of New England and southeast Canada in the next 2 weeks, it might assist some cold intrusions there. Although we get this warm windows that go in between these cold shots, and it may wipe out a lot of that snow. But the cold in the Midwest, back to the Rockies and Northern Plains, was a bit of a mystery because a lot of the guidance wasn't suggestive of something that cold. We've gone back in terms of model skill and model bias. We've kind of gone back to the European, kind of taking a warm tack in the late 11 to 15 day, just prior to the space that you're trying to verify for. And that has been a fairly winter-long position for the European ensemble, which is to be on the warmer side. The one exception, there's only been a few exceptions, but the one notable one was the one that was going into that period, which we talked about at the beginning of the briefing, I think for Feb 19 to 23, but that period in early February was those few days where the European marked out a colder view. Now it's gone back and it's pretty much maintained this warmish view. And by all accounts, now here we are on Friday, the 28th, and looking out in that window, it looks like, it will be exceptionally warm in the eastern third to half of the country, with only minor cold in kind of the intermountain west potentially. So, obviously hindsight's 2020, and I don't really like to, say like what I would have predicted, but going back and looking at some of the notes, the one thing that was interesting was the European ensemble view of maintaining the warmth. And then it's been a really great, the persistence of a warm view has been a really great verification this winter. The one exception was the period that you just verified for, when we had that rainy, cold stretch in the southeastern United States. But this period upcoming for the 11th to the 15th of March looks very warm at this point. But I'll be on the calls, hopefully, for the foreseeable future, and it'd be fun to kind of watch how that turns out. But it's looking like a fourth consecutive month of exceptional eastern southeast warmth.
I have another meeting coming up shortly, so I have to break away. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for coming, Dr. Roundy. We appreciate it.
No, thank you, Dr. Roundy. Appreciate it.
Is there anybody else on the call who I've missed and would like to discuss their forecasts for this week?
Well, I'm on the call. I don't think I have a whole lot of insight on my forecast. I mean, probably not as much as what's already been said, but yeah. Well, I mean, one thing I noted. So it seems that we are starting to see a bigger gap between the 30-year normals and the warmer, 10-year trend, et cetera. One of the things my hypothesis, giving more deference to the trend and the warmer kind of 10-year period. I mean, so I think we've seen it from the cold season, as we transition to the warm season. I think, sort of 10-year normals has started better than 30-year normals. And so one of the hypotheses is that as we go from, February into March, we start to see some of the variance diminish. And so some of that, I think, trend signal may emerge a little bit more cleanly than in the midwinter. So, and also I noted, a lot of dynamical guidance, the CFS and the EC were surprisingly consistent in terms of the warmth. I mean, how often do we see CFS that warm relative to average? So that was really striking. So the dynamical guidance suggesting that the ensemble showing we had warmth in the 11 to 15, and if anything, persisting or even intensifying that in the 16 to 20. So, I didn't have a whole lot of dynamical insight into that. So, we had the big ridge over the Pacific, negative P&A type, and just the fact that it seems like we want to, the tendency to be, we basically want to be warm in the east this winter, it seems. Although, I noted, we've had a lot more ups and downs lately, so it's not so persistent. So, in any case, my forecast was weighted towards those warmer signals with near normal confidence. But.
I guess this is, a question for anybody. This is my first time forecasting for this winter period. And I was curious, I kind of mentioned it before when I was talking about the verification. We're entering that period of March. And is that around the time where some of those southern states are no longer accumulating HCDs? Is there pretty much like a set time of the year that stops, or does it vary year to year? Does anyone know?
I can add to that. This is Dave D'Arcangelo at Susquehanna. Looking at, I'll just give you an example. Houston will go out of HDD range around the 20th of March. For Dallas, it's going to be about it'll be about 2 weeks later, so it'll be the first week in April. Just to give you a reference, and this is basically using 10-year averages. For a place like Atlanta, let's see if I find Atlanta on my spreadsheet here. Atlanta is actually maybe more like the late first, early second week of April. So we're still a bit of a ways from that. So for Texas, the Gulf Coast, and Florida, it's over the course of the next between like 2.5 and 3.5 weeks. I mean, for Florida, you're basically you're out of it anyway now, with the exception of the far north. Does that help?
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And then, of course, there's this kind of obviously like there's a, it's not really a rule of thumb, but like in general, the average temp in March, April, and May increases about between 2 and almost 3 degrees per week across the north. So if your Dallas, Atlanta changeover is the first 10 days of April, you're going to have to look at the Carolinas to say Oklahoma about a week or so later, and of course you can kind of mark that off progressively. So for northern latitudes, for like a New York, Chicago corridor, you're probably looking at my spreadsheet doesn't go out that far, but thinking it's around maybe the first week in May, close to the end of the first week in May.
Okay.
Yep. It's a fascinating time of year, sometimes because you've got this dual, potential for heating demand across the north and correspondingly cooling demand in the south. You can kind of get an interesting demand profile nationally. I'm speaking from an energy perspective. You can get early AC usage in the south while you're still getting, modest to decent heating demand in the north. And so you can get a little additive effect at times, but it doesn't look like we're going into a pattern where we're going to do that.
I guess briefly I can bring up what Maxar's outlook for this period was. I know they're not on the call, so they can't defend their forecast, but we can at least check it out and see what it looks like. They were the warmest forecasts that we had. So I think when we look at this report, and it kind of mirrors exactly what they forecasted. So it appears that they're going with a lot of warmth. Here were I was talking earlier, the EC and the CFS weeklies from that time period. So again, a lot of warmth that we saw. And again, it's always interesting. I've noticed when the EC and the CFS are both on the same side of the 30-year normal. It's always not necessarily a red flag, but something to certainly pay attention to. But it looks like they going warmth, and their risks. The GLAM brings risks for greater variability in the eastern half, as could a more coherent MJO propagation. Model consensus is not as warm as the forecast, particularly in the west, but this has been a bias in warm patterns this winter. So it'll certainly
makes me worry about my forecast.
Say that again?
So it certainly makes me worry about my forecast.
Yeah, there looks like there's a lot of variability in our forecast this week. Whereas, consistently, pretty much all of us have been on one side or the other. But, you and Dr. Decker are both on the colder side, and we got some people who are just below on the warmer side, and we got some really warm forecasts. So it'll certainly be interesting to see how this all plays out. Does anybody have any, final thoughts? I guess if not, we can end a little bit early. I guess I can, because I'm part of one of the people who schedules these forecasts. Is Does this 9:30 to 10:30 slot work for everybody? We're not going to consistently do it. We might alternate between Tuesdays and Fridays every other week, but does this time, work for everybody?
Yeah, it works for me.
Okay. Like I
In the
said,
spring semester, it generally works for me.
okay, cool. Yeah, as you all see in my many emails at the beginning of the semester, we're just trying to experiment. Like I said, someone like Dr. Roundy, who makes consistent forecasts every week, but isn't able to join the Tuesday discussions, we wanted to have him be able to come in on a Friday, and it was great having him. So, like I said, I'll be making sure to give everyone plenty of notice on the week-to-week basis to make sure everyone knows what day the discussion is going to be. But I guess I can say just be prepared. We might have some more of these Friday discussions. Okay. Well, like I said, if anyone else has any final thoughts, just chip in. But other than that, thanks everybody for coming. Again, Dr. Roundy, I know you're off, but thank you for joining us. And David D'Arcangelo, we look forward to having you in the future.
Yep. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah, everybody enjoy the rest of your day and have a nice weekend.
Thanks, you too.
Thank you.
Take care.